My name is Marina Brooks, and this is my story. I have always believed that a person's home holds their quiet soul, the part that the world doesn't see. My house, a small red brick building with white shutters, sits on a quiet street in Flagstaff, Arizona, nestled under tall pines that whisper when the wind passes through. I bought it 5 years ago, after years of saving for my design business, Brooks and Beam Interiors. Every paycheck, every bonus, every late-night client call, it all led to that down payment. It was my pride and my peace. The deed carried only one name, mine. That week, I had been in Boulder, Colorado, working on a contract for a small hotel renovation. The job wrapped up faster than expected, and I finished 2 days early. Most people would have stayed to rest, maybe visited a friend, but all I wanted was my bed, my kitchen, my routine. I caught the late bus back to Flagstaff. The ride was long and silent. The other passengers were dozing, their heads leaning against the windows. I watched the black highway stretch ahead, lights flickering past like brief memories. By the time I arrived home, it was nearly midnight. The sky was clear and cold, and the stars hung low enough to touch. My house looked the same from the outside, calm and still. The porch light glowed faintly, left on by the timer I had set before I left. I remember smiling, feeling that small joy of coming home earlier than expected. I dragged my suitcase up the steps and unlocked the door. The smell hit me first, sharp, chemical, and dusty, the scent of wet plaster and new paint. My first thought was that something had leaked. I stepped into the hallway, switched on the light, and froze. My hallway looked like a construction zone. The toilet was sitting on a blue tarp, the bathroom tiles stacked neatly beside it like dominoes. The kitchen door was open, and I could see pieces of wood, metal, and tools scattered across the floor. My beautiful marble countertop, the one I'd saved up months for, was gone, torn from the wall. The sink hung crookedly, like a broken jaw. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just stood there, my overnight bag still in my hand, the key still hanging from the lock. I thought maybe I'd walked into the wrong house, or maybe this was some kind of nightmare. Then I heard laughter, bright, familiar laughter, coming from the kitchen. Marina, a voice called. It was my sister, Evelyn Pike. She appeared in the doorway, wearing a paint-stained sweatshirt, her dark hair tied up in a messy knot. Behind her, her husband, Grant Pike, and his parents, Ruth and Wallace, stood grinning like they were hosting a surprise party. Evelyn spread her arms wide, smiling. Surprise. We're doing the renovations ahead of the move-in. Move-in. I repeated, the word falling flat. Grant, tall and broad-shouldered, held up a paint scraper. You'll love it, Marina. We thought we'd save you the trouble before we move in next month. The old tiles had to go anyway. I blinked. Move in, I said again, slowly, as if repeating it might make it make sense. Ruth laughed. Evelyn told us you said yes. We've been at it all day. You won't even recognize the place when it's done. For a moment, all I could hear was the faint hum of the fridge, or what was left of it. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I looked around the chaos, the piles of tools, the buckets of plaster, the paint stains on my hardwood floors. This wasn't a renovation. It was an invasion. But I didn't argue. I didn't even raise my voice. My words came out small and even. Okay, I said. They mistook my calm for approval. Grant grinned and turned back to the kitchen. Evelyn started talking about paint colors, countertops, and how they'd already ordered a new dishwasher. Ruth handed me a cup of coffee like this was a friendly homecoming. I didn't drink it. I just nodded, murmured something polite, and walked past them. My bedroom door was still closed. When I opened it, I saw that they hadn't touched it. My bed was still made, my books still on the shelf. I shut the door quietly behind me, sat down on the edge of the bed, and stared at the carpet. My hands were trembling, but I didn't cry. I just sat there, listening to their laughter echo through the walls. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound from the next room, a hammer hitting something, Grant's low voice, Evelyn's laughter, pressed against my chest like a weight. I thought about the months I spent saving for this house, about the way my father had once said, when you own a home, You own your peace. I thought about how Evelyn used to borrow money and promise to pay it back, how she always said, "You have enough, Marina." Maybe she thought I wouldn't mind. Maybe she thought family meant permission. At around 2 in the morning, I got up, walked quietly into the hallway, and looked at the mess again. The smell was worse now, fresh paint mixed with damp plaster. The toilet sat like a ghost in the hall. The tiles gleamed under the dim light. I stepped over a bucket and peeked into the kitchen. They had set up sleeping bags on the floor. Evelyn was asleep, her arm draped over Grant. Ruth and Wallace were snoring softly on the couch. It was my house. My name was on every bill, every document, every legal paper. And yet, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I went back to my room, sat at my desk, and opened my old silver laptop. The screen's glow filled the dark room. I opened my email and searched for the house deed file. When I found it, I stared at the line that said property owner, Marina and Brooks. I whispered the words to myself, as if they were a spell that might protect me. The next morning, I planned to call my lawyer just to ask what could be done. I didn't know yet that it would all turn into something much bigger. Police cars, legal filings, and a clean cut from my family. But that night, sitting there in my quiet room while my unwanted guests slept a few feet away, I understood something simple and sharp. Silence isn't peace when it's forced. The moonlight spilled across the floor, catching the edge of my suitcase. I hadn't even unpacked. Maybe that was good. Maybe I wouldn't stay long. Not until I decided what to do. I closed the laptop, turned off the light, and lay down, my bag still beside the bed. The air smelled of plaster dust and paint thinner. I could taste it when I breathed. I stared at the ceiling until dawn. My sister thought she was giving me a gift. Her husband thought he was being generous. But what they really gave me was a reminder that trust, like a home, can be torn apart in a single night. When morning finally came, I heard the faint sound of Evelyn's phone ringing in the other room. She laughed as she answered. The sun slipped through the blinds, warm and steady. I turned onto my side, watching the light crawl across the carpet, and whispered to myself, "This is still my house." I didn't know it yet, but within 24 hours, that quiet sentence would become my battle cry. The morning after my return felt strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, but before another one begins. The sunlight crept through the blinds in pale stripes, and for a few seconds, I almost convinced myself that the night before had been a dream. Then I heard a crash, the sharp clang of metal against tile, and a man's voice swearing under his breath. The smell of paint was still in the air. No, it hadn't been a dream. I sat up, feeling that familiar tightness in my chest. My room was still intact, the only untouched part of my house. My suitcase sat open at the foot of my bed, the clothes inside still folded, as if I hadn't really come home yet. Outside, I could hear Evelyn's cheerful tone as she gave someone instructions. "Just move it closer to the sink," she said. Her voice used to sound warm to me. That morning, it sounded like trespass. I reached for my phone and saw 5 missed calls from clients, one from my friend Hannah in Portland, and one from an unknown number. I ignored them all. Then the phone buzzed in my hand again, Evelyn's name flashing across the screen. Before I could answer, a loud banging echoed through the house, not from a hammer this time, but from the front door. Grant's voice followed, alarmed. "Evelyn, what the hell?" Then I heard sirens. I went to the window and pulled the curtain back. The street below was lit up with blue and red. 6 police cars lined the curb, their lights flashing against the pine trees and the neighbors' fences. Officers moved quickly, their radios crackling. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My phone rang again. This time, Evelyn's voice came through, shaky and small. "Marina, there are 6 police cars outside the house." "I know," I said quietly. "I can see them. Did you call them?" I didn't answer right away. I watched the officers step onto the front porch, their boots crunching over bits of broken tile. "I didn't call," I said finally. "The neighbors probably did. They saw what's been happening here." A loud knock came from the front door. "Flagstaff Police Department." A woman's voice called out. I slipped into my sweater, tied my hair back, and went to open it. Standing there was a calm-looking officer, her dark uniform crisp against the morning light. She had sharp eyes and a notebook in her hand. "Miss Brooks?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I'm Officer Lila Morton. We've had reports from neighbors about a break-in and property damage." She looked down at her clipboard, then back at me. "We also received a statement about a possible family dispute regarding ownership." Behind her, another officer, younger, nervous, glanced toward the kitchen window, where Evelyn's shadow moved past the curtain. "This house is mine," I said clearly. "They do not have my permission to be here. They tore out my bathroom, my toilet, my kitchen counters. I told them not to move in." Officer Morton's eyes softened slightly, but her voice stayed professional. "Do you have proof of ownership, Ms. Brooks?" "Yes." "Wait here." I went to my room, opened my desk drawer, and pulled out a folder. Inside were my mortgage documents, the deed, and last year's property tax bill. I brought them back to the porch. She flipped through the papers quickly and nodded. "All right. That's clear. Thank you." By now, Evelyn had come to the door, her face pale and her hands trembling. "This is ridiculous," she said, trying to smile. "We're family, Marina. We were fixing up the place for you." "For me?" I asked quietly. "Yes," she said, but her voice cracked. Grant stepped forward. "Look, officer, this is all a misunderstanding. We weren't breaking in. We were helping. You know how sisters are. It's a gift, really." Behind him, Ruth folded her arms tightly, muttering about ungrateful behavior. Wallace, red-faced and silent, just stared at the ground. Officer Morton didn't react. "Sir," she said, "did Miss Brooks give you written or verbal permission to perform renovations on this property?" Grant opened his mouth, then closed it again. "She didn't say no," he muttered. "She didn't say yes either," I replied. The officer nodded and made a note. "All right. We're going to need to document the property and speak to everyone separately." She signaled to her team. Two officers entered the house with cameras, another began asking the neighbors questions. I stepped aside as they walked through, their flashlights glinting off the ruined tiles and broken fixtures. I felt exposed, like someone had torn open the walls of my life for everyone to see. Evelyn stood by the door, whispering to Grant, who now looked far less confident. Ruth muttered something about family not meaning what it used to. Wallace sighed, shaking his head. Officer Morton returned a few minutes later, her notebook full. "Ms. Brooks," she said, "would you be willing to provide a written statement today?" "Yes," I said. "I'll do it now." We sat at the small porch table, the same one where I used to have coffee on summer mornings. My hands trembled as I wrote. I explained how I'd returned early from Boulder, found my home torn apart, and was told by my sister that they were moving in. I wrote how I never gave permission for any renovations, and how I had proof of ownership. When I was done, I signed the bottom of the page and handed it to her. She read it carefully, then nodded. "This helps a lot," she said. "We'll file the report and forward it to the county office." As she turned to leave, she paused. "I have to say, Ms. Brooks, you handled this calmly. Most people would have lost their temper." "I already lost enough," I said. She gave a faint smile. "Fair enough." When the officers left, the street slowly returned to normal. The flashing lights faded, and the sound of engines drifted away down the hill. Evelyn stood on the porch, her face pale, eyes full of something between shame and fear. "Marina," she said, "we didn't mean—" "I don't want to talk about it," I said quietly. "Not now." Grant tried to speak, but I turned and went back inside. The house was a wreck, but for the first time since I'd returned, it felt like mine again. The air was still thick with dust, but the silence had weight, a kind of protection. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, looking at the place where the sink used to be. My reflection shone faintly in the metal of the torn pipes. The day had started with sirens and ended in quiet, but I knew it wasn't over. Outside, I could still see faint tire marks on the road where the police cars had been. The neighbors peeked through their blinds, pretending not to. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, then stopped. I leaned against the doorway, folded my arms, and took a deep breath. My heart was still pounding, but underneath it all was a slow, steady rhythm. The feeling that comes when something wrong finally starts to be made right. That night, I locked every door and every window. I checked them twice. The house smelled like paint and dust, but also, faintly, like peace trying to return. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing. I wasn't leaving my home again. Not for a business trip, not for a weekend, not for anyone. This house was mine, and after that morning, no one would ever forget it. The next morning, sunlight slid across the kitchen floor, catching on the piles of torn tile and broken wood. My house felt like a stranger's place, hollow, rearranged, violated. But beneath that mess, something steady had awakened in me, the will to take my home back. I showered in silence, using the half-installed bathroom sink, then made a strong cup of coffee and sat by the window. I could hear my sister and her husband whispering upstairs, their voices sharp and nervous. I didn't listen to their words. I had stopped caring. What mattered now was that the house was legally mine, and I was going to prove it. At 8:30 a.m., I called Jordan Hale, a real estate attorney whose office was downtown in Flagstaff. His tone turned professional the second he heard what had happened. "They entered your property without consent?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "They tore up my kitchen, bathroom, and toilet. They even ordered materials in my name." He let out a low whistle. "Bring me everything, photos, receipts, your deed. This qualifies as unlawful entry and property damage. We'll file a case today." Within an hour, I had my folder ready, the house deed, my mortgage records, and printed photos of the destruction. I also tucked in a handful of receipts I'd found on the counter, each showing orders made by Grant Pike for items shipped to my address. Jordan's office sat between an old bookstore and a coffee shop. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and printer ink. He was a tall man with silver hair and sharp gray eyes. He flipped through my documents carefully. "This is clear-cut," he said. "They'll try to say it was a misunderstanding, but the law doesn't see it that way. You own the house. They had no permission." He drafted the complaint himself, quiet, efficient, deliberate. I signed every page, without hesitation. The filing fee was $1,500, which I paid immediately. Jordan leaned back in his chair and said, "You'll need to be home this afternoon. The police will come to enforce removal once this goes through." When I returned to my house, Officer Lila Morton, the same calm woman from before, was already waiting by the gate. "Ms. Brooks," she said, "we have the court order for removal and seizure of tools. We'll handle it." Inside, chaos unfolded. Evelyn was pacing the living room, her voice high with panic. Grant tried to talk over her, waving his hands, while his parents packed boxes in silence. The police entered quietly but firmly. Officer Morton's voice carried through the hallway. "You are required to vacate the property immediately. All construction tools must be collected and removed. You are not to return without written consent from Ms. Brooks." Grant glared at me. "We were helping you. You're really calling the cops on your own family?" I met his eyes. "You helped yourself." Evelyn began to cry. "Marina, please. We just wanted to make it better for everyone." I shook my head. "You wanted to move into something that isn't yours." The officers guided them out. No shouting, no handcuffs, just quiet humiliation. Watching them leave, I felt both heartbreak and relief. Evelyn looked back at me once from the sidewalk, her face pale and streaked with tears. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. "Yes," I said softly. "I did." By late afternoon, Jordan called with updates. The case had gone through Judge Carla Newton, who issued a preliminary ruling within hours. Because all the paperwork proved my ownership, the court recognized my claim immediately. Evelyn and her family were charged with property damage and trespassing. A local contractor, hired by Jordan to estimate the damage, sent a report that evening. $6,200 for the bathroom, $3,750 for the kitchen, plus the cost of cleaning and repairs, nearly $10,000 total. The judge added fines for unlawful entry and unauthorized renovation, bringing the total penalty to $18,400. When I heard the number, I closed my eyes and exhaled. For the first time in days, I felt the ground under me again. That night, as the police escorted them to collect the last of their things, Evelyn came up the steps holding a box of tools. "We'll pay," she said quietly. "I'm sorry." I didn't answer. I just stood in the doorway and watched her walk to the car. When they were gone, I stepped inside and locked the door. The house was damaged, yes, but the air felt different. It belonged to me again. The silence was no longer heavy. It was clean, earned. I walked through each room, tracing the walls with my fingertips. My house was scarred but still standing, just like me. And as the night settled over Flagstaff, I whispered into the stillness, "It's over." But deep down, I knew it wasn't over yet. Not entirely. Because money could fix walls, but trust? That was gone forever. The morning after the court ruling felt like waking up in a new world. Not because anything magical had happened overnight, but because peace had finally returned to the air. For the first time in weeks, my home was empty. No voices echoing through the walls. No laughter from people who didn't belong. No clattering of tools or footsteps on my stairs. Just silence, clean and deep. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, looking at what was left of the mess. The counters were gone, the cabinet doors hung unevenly, and the tiles were cracked and dusty. My reflection shimmered faintly in the steel of the torn sink. It looked back at me with a mixture of exhaustion and pride. This house was bruised, but it was still mine. Later that morning, my phone buzzed. Evelyn's name appeared on the screen. I almost ignored it, but something in me needed to hear her voice, not for comfort, but for closure. "Marina," she said softly, "we paid the fine. All of it. I just wanted to let you know." "Good," I said. "That's how it should be." She hesitated. "We're staying with Grant's parents in Prescott for a while. Maybe we can talk soon." I didn't answer right away. I looked around the ruined room and thought about how easily trust can be destroyed. "Maybe," I said, though I already knew I didn't mean it. "Take care of yourself, Evelyn." When the call ended, I stood for a long moment staring at the quiet phone. There was no anger left, just distance, wide and necessary. By noon, I had made a plan. I wasn't going to let this house sit broken. I called Tara Vaughn, a contractor recommended by Officer Morton, who had checked in on me the night before. Tara arrived that afternoon, clipboard in hand, her blonde hair pulled back under a cap. "Well," she said, surveying the place, "it's a good house. Strong foundation. They did some damage, but nothing we can't fix." "How long will it take?" I asked. 2 weeks, tops," she replied. "Bathroom first, kitchen second. We'll make it right again." I nodded. "Do it." The crew began the next morning. For days, my house hummed with the sounds of hammers and drills, but this time, it was the sound of healing, not intrusion. I brought the workers coffee every morning, watched as they reinstalled the toilet and retiled the bathroom. The air smelled of plaster again, but now it carried a promise. When the kitchen counters arrived, smooth gray granite, cool under my fingertips, I felt something loosen inside me. It wasn't about the money, though I paid $9,950 in total and kept every receipt in a new blue folder labeled Home Repairs. It was about reclaiming what was mine, piece by piece. During those days, Officer Lila Morton stopped by twice, just to check in. She waved from her car each time, and I waved back. Her quiet kindness had steadied me through the worst part, and I would always remember that. At night, when the workers were gone and the tools were packed away, I sat at the small table by the kitchen window. The stars over Flagstaff burned bright against a cold sky, and I finally felt safe again. I began keeping a journal, something I hadn't done in years, writing down every person who had helped me. Jordan Hale, my attorney. Officer Lila Morton, who listened first and spoke second. Tara Vaughn and her crew, who rebuilt what others destroyed. Mr. Colton, my neighbor, who brought coffee and kept watch when things got bad. I also made another list, a shorter one, of things I would never allow again. People entering my home without my permission. Surprise gifts or forced help. Raised voices in my safe space. Trust without proof. 2 weeks later, when the final repairs were done, the house looked whole again. The bathroom gleamed white and clean. The kitchen smelled faintly of new wood and soap. Even the hallway, once lined with dust and broken tiles, now shone beneath a fresh coat of paint. I stood in the doorway that evening, watching the sunset turn the windows gold. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the house, steady and familiar. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. That weekend, I took a small trip to Prescott, not to see Evelyn but to breathe, to remind myself that there was more to the world than courtrooms and repairs. I wandered through antique shops, bought new towels, and stopped at a cafe where no one knew my name. The waitress called me honey and asked about my day, and it felt good to be just another face in a room full of strangers. On the drive home, the highway stretched endlessly ahead, winding through pine forests and red rock hills. The sky over America was wide and forgiving. For a moment, I thought about Europe, places I'd only ever dreamed of visiting, but I knew deep down my story belonged here. This was my country, my home, my fight. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light blinked on automatically, the timer I'd set weeks earlier still faithful. The house glowed warmly in the dusk, quiet and proud. I turned off the engine and sat there for a while, watching the light spill over the front steps. Inside, everything felt new yet familiar. I brewed a cup of chamomile tea, leaned against the counter, and listened to the sound of my own breathing. The house didn't feel like an empty shell anymore. It felt alive, as if it had forgiven me for what had happened. People say family matters are messy. They are. But houses have rules, walls, studs, and boundaries that mean something. Money can be counted. Walls can be repaired. But respect, once broken, doesn't rebuild so easily. My name is Marina Brooks, and my name is on this house. That's what matters. I told the truth, filed the case, stood my ground, and let the law and the silence do the rest. Now the kitchen smells like soap again. The bathroom works. The front door locks with a clean, confident click. And every time I walk through these rooms, I feel that quiet, powerful truth settle inside me. I am home. That's the whole story, 4 rooms, 4 chapters, 1 life reclaimed. And though the scars remain, so does the peace. I count my blessings now not in dollars, but in stillness. Because in the end, that's what freedom sounds like. Nothing at all.